Welcome, friends, new and returning to the March episode of Texas Talks. We're excited to showcase a special partnership for TSHA tonight with the German Texas Heritage Society, the Dallas Gaeta Center, and the University of Texas at Arlington. Before we begin, since we have some new faces in the crowd, I'd like to remind everyone of the process for the recording. If everyone would kindly keep their camera and mic off throughout the presentation. After the speakers conclude their presentation, we'll be taking questions from y'all, but you'll have to submit them through the chat box. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little box that says chat. If you click on that, it'll pop up the chat bubble and you can type your questions into that. And me and my co-host will be reading those questions aloud to the presenters. So I would like to welcome my special guest and co-host for the evening, Margot Blevins, the president of the German Texas Heritage Society. Margot is a researcher with the Texas German Dialect Project, housed within the Germanic Studies Department at the University of Texas at Austin, and has a PhD from that same department with a focus on Texas German linguistics. She's been involved with the Texas German Heritage Society since 2013 and became president of the board of directors in January. Margot, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I'm very excited for the opportunity to partner with you to highlight this absolutely incredible book. The German Texan Heritage Society is a nonprofit organization committed to the preservation of the history and heritage of Texas Germans. Our headquarters are housed at the German Free School, which is the third oldest building in Austin. And it was one of the schools that would later lay the groundwork for Texas's first public education system. Many of our members are 5th, 6th, 7th generation Texas German, and we have lots of other sort of historical treasures, and we're very excited to be here. Thank you.
We are excited to have you. This evening, Dr. Christopher Wickham and Dr. Daniel Gelo will discuss their new book, The German Texas Frontier in 1853, and the role of Ferdinand Lindheimer, the father of Texas Botany, in helping his fellow immigrants adapt to the physical and social environments of Antebellum Texas through his editorship of the Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung, thereby beginning the creation of a unique German Texan identity. Both authors are a professor emeriti at the University of Texas, San Antonio, Dr. Wickham in German and Dr. Gelo in anthropology, who specialized in Comanche culture and linguistics. Their publications on German Texan and Comanche relations include Comanches, Captives, and Germans, and Comanches and Germans on the Texas Frontier, the ethnology of Heinrich Berghaus, about the creation of the first Comanche German dictionary stemming from the 1847 Moisenbach Comanche Treaty. Thank you for joining us this evening, Dr. Wickham and Dr. Gelo.
Thanks, Angel, for that very nice introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. Good evening. We're really grateful to the German Texan Heritage Society, along with the Texas State Historical Association, the Dallas Gaeta Center, and the University of Texas at Arlington. And we particularly want to thank Eddie Walsh, Margot Blevins, Jay Jones, Manuela Markley, Barbara Berthold, and Angel Baltry for hosting us. Chris and I always enjoy participating or at least attending the programs of the societies mentioned, and we're honored to have our research featured here this evening. I'll turn it over to Chris to get started.
Thank you, Dan. I'm trying to get our PowerPoint to advance and might need to just do a little work on that in order to make sure we are where we want to be. One moment here, if you'll bear with me. Let me just do it this way. Slideshow from beginning. All right. Our presentation is based on research we conducted for our book, the German Texas frontier in 1853. This is the third book in a series of studies that have grown out of our work on the contact between Comanches and Germans in the Texas Hill Country. Our principal source tonight is the reporting in the newspaper, the Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung, during its first year of publication, November 1852 to November 1853. The editor at this time, and indeed for the next 20 years, is Ferdinand Lindheimer, who has ended his activity as a traveling botanist, systematically gathering Texas plants for collections around the world that earned him the well-deserved title Father of Texas Botany, and has settled down with his wife and family in his home at 491 South Kamal Avenue in Neu-Braunfelser. Perhaps some of you have had the chance to visit the home. The Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung newspaper is an underused research resource for Texas history and German immigration, and we made an exhaustive analysis of its contents during that first year of publication, translating many articles in the newspaper from German into English, and from among the many topics covered in the 208 5 and later 6-column pages, we will be looking at and providing some context for how Lindheimer's paper talks about Indians, the natural environment, and precious metals. And then we'll also take a few moments to talk about the importance of the Moisebach-Comanche Treaty of 1847. Lindheimer's most important reporter in the field was Theodor Specht of Fredericksburg, and Specht is the subject of another of our research projects. We should remember too that in 1852, Lindheimer has already been living in Texas for over 15 years, while the majority of his Neu-Braunfelser, Fredericksburg, and other Texas readers left Germany less than 5 years previously. Many of the German settlers in Central Texas, and therefore readers of the newspaper, had arrived with the German Immigration Company, the Adelsverein, with this project that was particularly productive between 1846 and 1849. The project was the brainchild of a group of German noblemen and one woman who supported migration to ease population overcrowding and economic pressure in the German states, to promote their own interests in business, commerce, and influence abroad, and to head off feared political unrest as living conditions worsened and revolutionary sentiment grew at home. The Immigration Company contracted with the Republic of Texas to settle the Fisher-Miller Grant, a vast tract of land north of the Llano and south of the Colorado rivers, and they established 2 towns as way stations for new arrivals as they traveled up from the Gulf Coast, Neu-Braunfelser and Fredericksburg. Because the land promised for settlement was occupied by native peoples, particularly Penataka Comanches, the Commissioner General of the German Immigration Company, John O. Moisebach, took the initiative to make a non-aggression pact and mutual support agreement with headmen of this Indian band. There is considerable literature on the negotiations and the establishment of the so-called Moisebach-Comanche Treaty, notably the detailed account of geologist Ferdinand Lindheimer, who was present at the negotiations, so we will not be elaborating on that further here. The treaty, finalized in May of 1847, is an important part of the historical context for the Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung and its core readership. We'll return to the consequences of the treaty later in our presentation.
Let's see what was said about Indians in the 1853 Zeitung. The activities of Indians on the frontier and the question of their long-term fate, the so-called Indian question, are constant subjects for Lindheimer during his first year of publication of the Zeitung. He gives several reports of Indian depredations and military responses that come from his sources on the German frontier and which often do not appear in other records. He also publishes news items and a legend about Indian activities in other parts of Texas. In addition, there are articles about legislative debates on the Indian question, as well as historical sketches and legends about Indians in Florida, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, upstate New York, and even Central America. These latter, more distant items are didactic and seem intended to give Zeitung readers historical context for current local events. Lindheimer is very purposeful in providing these various stories. He had long personal experience with natives, from those in Mexico to others he met later while collecting plants in Texas. He was acquainted with the Comanche chief Santa Anna, who at one point even offered to buy and adopt Lindheimer's young son, Eugen. Lindheimer's musings, published outside the newspaper, include reflections on Indian cannibalism and what he calls crimes of the Texas government against Indians. In the newspaper, as in these other writings, Lindheimer is at pains to handle native issues with an even hand, treating the Indians for the most part with dignity, humanity, and understanding. This is not to say that stories of brutality and savagery are ignored, or that Lindheimer's correspondents did not betray negative opinions of Indians in their dispatches, but fair-mindedness is the guiding editorial principle. Let's look at a few examples. This first comes from the reporter Theodore Specht on January 17th of 1853 and refers to one of those short-lived German settlements on the north bank of the Llano River. He writes, "One of the first settlers in the settlement of Leiningen on the Llano, a poor but very hardworking man by the name of Gat, was murdered and scalped by the Indians while looking for cattle. His family was expecting him back in the evening, but in vain, and when he had not yet returned the following morning, some of his neighbors rode out to look for him, but they did not find him. 5 men searched every day, and only on the 5th day was he found by the settler Herr Kota. Gat had been shot and lay face down. The bullet had passed through his chest and exited his body again at the back. The dead man had been scalped, and then the murderers had set fire all around him, probably to burn the body and hide the every trace of the evil deed. The sight of the half-burned, scalped body is said to have been horrible." As Specht tells it, the searchers surmised from the tracks present that the Indians approached on foot in a friendly manner, allowing them to grab Gat's mule. They followed the mule's trail down to where it disappeared into the Llano River. They had almost no doubt that the murderers were a band of Tonkawas known to be across the river. The incident, Specht continued, was reported immediately to Fort Mason, 20 miles away. Amazingly, a soldier there testified that he was Gat's killer. The colonel in command had Specht's informant Koenig and another settler named Leifesta brought to the fort for questioning, which quickly established that the dragoon who confessed to the murder was out of his mind. Koenig and Leifesta told the colonel they suspected the Tonkawas, citing some other recent incidents. The Germans insisted that the colonel needed to send troops to help drive away or capture the Indians because there were not enough settlers to do this without aid, but he refused. Another dramatic episode concerns a raid by dragoons from Fort Mason on a camp of Lipan Apaches on the upper Nueces River near Chalk Bluff. 3 Indians were killed and several wounded, and their livestock was seized along with 19 prisoners. Specht writes, "On returning to Fredericksburg after being away for several days, I saw the dragoons who had been sent out in pursuit of Lipan Indians passing through here with a captive Lipan Indian. They had only caught 1 male Indian. The captured women and children were transported to Fort Mason. About 150 horses and mules, which the dragoons had captured from the Indians, are still at Fort Martin Scott, and several of them were recognized as stolen from here. They were reclaimed and returned to their owners. It appears that they now want to get serious about tackling the Indian robber bands. It was soon learned, however, that these Indians, starving and peacefully intentioned, had been instructed to gather at Chalk Bluff by their Indian agent so he could secure some aid for them. And so a few weeks later, a dispatch from Fredericksburg tells us that the Lapons had been in the town again since the day before, and inspects words, quote, "what we all suspected has happened," unquote. Not only were the Indians given their horses and mules back, but everything of theirs that the dragoons burned was being replaced. Specht writes, "The horses and mules have up to now been fed and protected here at Fort Martin Scott at the expense of the government and have been made pretty fat. The same is true of the captured women and children up at Fort Mason, who have now also been released and are all here today. Today, all the stores here were placed under requisition, and a large quantity of merchandise was purchased and given to the Indians as gifts." This transaction, incidentally, at Fort Martin Scott appears to be the subject of Friedrich Richard Petrie's last uncompleted painting. And we can look at this painting in more detail during the Q&A session if there's interest in doing so. Overall, 14 Indian incidents are reported for the year, several of which are not documented elsewhere. The Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung generally downplays the Indian threat, and indeed, by mid-year of 1853, there is a reduction in hostilities, one that has been noted by several historians. Thus, in September of 1853, we have this report from Leiningen, where Henry Gatt had been murdered just 9 months earlier. Quote, "How things look with the Indians up here is shown by the fact that the appearance of an Indian in the settlements would cause as much amazement as it would in the streets of New Braunfels, because in the past year not a single Comanche has visited the settlements here, much to the regret of our farmers. It used to be the case that there was a not insignificant trade in bear grease, hides, horses, etc." Stepping back and looking at the more general material that Lindheimer published, we can look at one example of the Indian coverage further afield, the stories that Lindheimer ran on Billy Bowlegs, the notorious leader of the Seminoles in Florida. This was a big story all around the country at the time. The Seminoles had been fighting a long war of resistance, and Bowlegs had recently reneged on a promise to move his people to Oklahoma. Now, Lindheimer actually missed an interesting local tie-in to this nationwide story. General William S. Harney, who was the commander at Fort Mason, it turns out, was an old foe of Billy Bowlegs, and his unit had suffered a famous massacre at the hands of the Seminoles back in 1839. And Harney would be sent back to Florida in 1856 to put an end to the Seminole conflict once and for all. Lindheimer misses this connection, but for the moment, he's serving up some more distant excitement while implicitly teaching his readers how matters might unfold in Texas if a more enlightened approach to Indian affairs was not developed.
When entering the Comanche and Lipan Apache lands for the purpose of settlement, the German immigrants, whether or not they were sponsored by the German Immigration Company, the Adelsverein, they were going to have to become acquainted with the natural resources of this new homeland and learn to survive using them. In some ways, the native populations could be helpful with this. And in any event, Lindheimer's Zeitung saw that it had a role to play in helping German immigrants understand and come to terms with the new land. Let's take a look at what Lindheimer's Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung has to say on some of these matters. Oddly, we might think the water supply does not feature prominently as a concern. It is mentioned as a very positive asset when principal rivers and, quote, a large number of clear, cool streams, end quote, are mentioned in a report by George von Ross, Lindheimer's co-editor, comparing the advantages of Texas to Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and other Midwestern options as a destination for immigrants. While Lindheimer's Zeitung does not position the availability of water as a central topic, its importance becomes evident through some direct and some more oblique references. The dual notorious features of flash floods and drought are summoned in Theodor Specht's observations of driftwood high in the trees along Cypress Creek near Comfort, Texas, and a report on diminishing river flow, which appears later in the year. An anonymous report from Fort Mason tells of downpours of over 4 inches each during June 22nd to 24th and July 25th to 27th, 1853. In the first storm, a farmer and his 6 mules were washed away while trying to cross the Llano. Pieces of the wagon were found 7 miles downstream, but there was no trace of the farmer or his stock. During the second storm, 6 wagons laden with supplies and 24 mules from Fort Mason were lost on the Guadalupe. Because hill country rainfall was sporadic and extreme, German water mills designed for old world conditions did not function well. Hermann Altgelt's inaptly named Perseverance Mill on Cypress Creek in Comfort washed out soon after it was built. He rebuilt it, but then had to abandon it within 2 years owing to the drought. Flooding and drought are also behind reported events such as the migration of Mormon settlers and the surrender of starving Lipan Apaches. Natural food resources feature occasionally in the newspaper. Hunting is touched upon in Lindheimer's own article on the bald cypress tree, where he describes wild turkey roosts. And gourd-like plants, including melons, pumpkins, and squashes, are discussed in a January 1853 article. Lindheimer's co-editor, von Ross, mentions sweet Mustang grapes when he compares the virtues of Texas with Midwestern states. One critical resource which occupied the minds of settlers and the editorial pen of Lindheimer in 1853 was timber. Theodor Specht dwells on the availability of wood in his February 5th, 1853 reconnaissance of the Upper Guadalupe Valley. He travels with an unnamed American shingle maker, likely Joshua D. Brown, the first settler of Kerrville, Texas, or one of his 9 or 10 partners in the lumber business. These men were drawn to the Upper Guadalupe Valley in 1846 in search of bald cypress, the Taxodium disticum, which form towering gallery forests along the riverbanks of the Guadalupe and other hill country rivers further south. In fact, these rivers provide the bulbous westernmost extension of the natural range of this southeastern species. Lindheimer, the botanist, wrote an appreciation of the noble tree, and such was his enthusiasm that he serialized his essay in the first 2 issues of the Zeitung, which is where he discusses hunting turkeys. Cypress, rot-resistant and self-sealing when wet, was in heavy demand for roof shingles, water tank staves, and other domestic uses. By the early 1850s, shingle making had already become a small industry along hill country rivers, with sawmills at Sisterdale, Comfort, Zodiac near Fredericksburg, and shingle camps at the location of present-day Kerrville, at Brownsboro in Kendall County, and elsewhere. Scarcity was already becoming a threat and a problem, however. Specht had written in a newspaper article in the Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung of 1853, quote, "Cypresses are to be found here," that is along the Guadalupe at Sisterdale, "in large quantities, even though the shingle makers have cleaned a lot of them out. And once Herr Zink's sawmill is fully up and running, it will take care of processing the rest of them." Wood is one of the essential resources for Specht when he complains about the location of Fredericksburg. Quote, What a piece of good fortune it would be for Fredericksburg if it were laid out on the banks of the Guadalupe. It seems as if the officials of the Adelsverein intentionally chose the worst place for it. Here, the small amount of land which the poor emigrants received only after waiting 2 years could only be made fit for cultivating through unspeakable toil and hard work. The numerous trees that stood on the land were worth almost nothing, because most of them are hollow or rotten on the inside. Even though Fredericksburg lies in the middle of a great wooded valley, Specht writes, there is a great shortage of fence wood. Searching for cattle is a true hardship here, and several head get lost. All of these inconveniences are unknown along the Guadalupe. End of the quote. The availability of wood for fences and pens that so exercised Specht was an important factor for the Germans, one easily overlooked today. When the settlers of Castell, one of the colonies on the north side of the Llano River, pioneered from Fredericksburg in 1847, first arrived at that site, they immediately formed work crews for the tasks deemed essential, including one for fence building. Some of the early Fredericksburg artist Friedrich Richard Petri's works, including this untitled pencil sketch of an area farmstead, illustrate in detail the styles of upright and rail wooden fencing that were built. Petri's circa 1852 watercolor, The Pioneer Cow Pen, also shows a rail fence and substantial gate along with the chimneyed cabin on his own farm. Even though dense growth of mountain cedar, that is the ash juniper, covered the hill country uplands during the early years of settlement, cedar and other useful species sought by the settlers, such as post oak, were apparently not as plentiful as desired in the Fredericksburg vicinity. Greater quantities of fence wood were needed in this early era, before the advent of wire fencing in the 1880s. Pre-wire alternatives to wood fencing required extraordinary labor. The Germans built several tall stone boundary fences and enclosures that still stand in this area. And Alsatian settlers at Vandenberg on Henri Castro's grant in Medina County resorted to digging a huge ditch to prevent their cattle from straying. In early 1853, Specht complained, justifiably, that searching for cattle and losing them were common hardships, as we see in the example of Henry Gatt. Specht was clearly not alone in his worries over wood, for some months later, the Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung ran a weekly ad placed by settler Joseph Landa, calling for information leading to the arrest of those stealing wood from his property above Demijohn Bend on the Guadalupe River. Landa offered a reward of 100 silver dollars, which seems to indicate that timber poaching was considered a serious crime. This would be about $4,000 today.
One kind of resource that gets special attention in the Zeitung is precious metal, mainly gold, sometimes silver, or meteoric iron. Most of us are familiar with the treasure legends of the San Saba country, and the Germans heard these too. They were also alerted to the potential for precious metals in the mining reports of Alexander von Humboldt going back to 1808 in his assessment of Mexico. And Humboldt was an intellectual beacon for so many of the Germans. John Moisebach's first exploration into the Fisher-Miller Grant in part was to seek the lost Spanish mines, but he did not find them. And his staff scientist, Ferdinand Lindheimer, determined that the area mineralogy was incompatible with silver. The French naturalist Berlandier, exploring for the Mexican government around 1830, had earlier come to the same conclusion. Nevertheless, at least one of Lindheimer's correspondents from the frontier was fixated on the scant presence of gold in Sandy Creek and elsewhere from the Llano River north to the Colorado. and Lindheimer was intrigued enough to sustain weekly reporting about gold prospecting in the Fisher-Miller Grant and indeed around the world. Here's a report on the Fredericksburg region from Thomas Speck, dated January 12th of 1853. He writes, "A short time ago, I undertook a hunting trip to Sandy Creek, and although the area is very unsafe because of the many Indians who roam there, I could not resist the desire to visit the Sandy." He then goes on at length about the environment in the area of the creek, and he concludes, "From all of this, you will see clearly enough that Sandy Creek will in future play a significant role here in the state, for there is almost no doubt at all that the hills contain gold and silver. The best silver diggings will be the fertile banks of the creek, and those farming here will find their efforts richly rewarded." The April 22nd, 1853 issue of the Zeitung carried lengthy correspondence from an unidentified writer lamenting the editor's seeming indifference to the gold issue. The writer acknowledged that Germans were not very interested in the matter, but he ventured that it was too important to ignore. Some German settlers, he noted, who were out searching for their cattle, had come upon Mormons who had earlier passed through Fredericksburg and had settled along Sandy Creek, where they were secretively washing gold. Their yield was unknowable, but must have been appreciable, the writer speculated, because they were building permanent cabins, but not farming. Chris and I were unable to find any other historical evidence of this interesting Mormon presence in the area north of Fredericksburg. Insistent about gold, Specht returns to the printed page on May 20th of 1853 with an account of his two recent trips to Sandy Creek around Enchanted Rock. During the second trip, he brings along an unnamed companion who had been a mining foreman in Germany and, quote, knows what he is talking about, unquote. The two men work to exhaustion without finding anything and conclude that any gold is deep in the sands of the creek and only accessible with special equipment. Specht admits that he is sick of the hard work and would sooner split fence rails than dig for gold. Yet he is tempted to survey the creeks to the north with his friend in coming weeks, and he promises to report on that trip. None of this was really news to Lindheimer, for we find a map drawn by Lindheimer about 4 years earlier, based on his explorations as a botanist, which shows the region of settlement, and along one creek, there's the label Waschgold, placer gold. This is a tributary joining the Llano River just west of Castell. This map was never published in the newspaper, and Lindheimer did not make reference to it, but he clearly had some inkling ahead of all the other reporters about the presence of some gold. We'll be discussing this map, incidentally, in more detail in a presentation for the General Land Office Symposium on Texas History coming up in November of this year. A terse counterpoint to Texas gold fever is added by the newspaper editors just a few lines below Specht's remarks about the Enchanted Rock area. This date line is California. Quote, "The reports from the mines in California indicate rich gold discoveries, but are even richer in murder stories." Lindheimer is very cautious about gold and its implications for society, and his efforts to temper enthusiasm are clearly rooted in the sober outlook of Humboldt and a desire to distinguish the noble German character. He writes, "These rumors of gold show us once again the clear differences between the German and the Anglo-American character. The Germans here are completely unaffected by gold fever, brought about by various reports of a gold field barely 70 miles away. You can often hear people saying things like, 'I'd prefer it if they found a lot of good iron and there would be mines and factories with a hardworking and honest class of people, rather than having the prospecting bringing adventurers and riffraff into the land.'" Lindheimer writes, These attitudes deserve praise and are healthy for our country. By the same token, Lindheimer writes with some grudging admiration for the adventurous and profligate tendencies of the Anglo-American hordes, likening them, as a good botanist might, to plants that spread by issuing wasteful amounts of pollen and which can afford to bear many flowers to produce a single fruit. You've noticed by now that our summary of Lindheimer's newspaper coverage is based largely on the work of Theodor Specht, and the Zeitung printed at least 15 reports from Specht's pen between 1852 and 1856. In addition, Specht advertised a guest house that he owned in Fredericksburg in the advertising pages of the Zeitung. And based on his role as postmaster in Fredericksburg, he acted as subscription agent for the Neu-Braunfelser newspaper in Fredericksburg. And we will be making a thorough examination of Specht's career on the frontier and his role in history in a later work that we hope to publish before too long.
Let us return briefly to one of the key elements of the context in which the first year of Lindheimer's newspaper was appearing, the Moisebach-Comanche Treaty that had been signed 5.5 years earlier in 1857. What can we say about the conditions the treaty created? First, it's interesting to note that there were evidently unwritten agreements associated with the treaty. For instance, the text of the treaty document states that it applies explicitly to the lands between the Llano and the San Saba rivers. And yet it is clear from the historical record that its terms of peace and mutual support were observed also in Fredericksburg, which lies well south of the Llano, though this settlement is not mentioned by name. Further, it is evident that there was an understanding that a German representative would go to live with the Penataka Comanches as a kind of guarantor of good faith, though this too is omitted from the document itself. This role was filled by the settler Emil Krivitz, and whether Krivitz was more of a hostage, a mediator, or an agent is hard to say. But we do know that during his 4-month stay with Headman Santa Anna, Krivitz created 3 invaluable contributions to our knowledge of Comanche life. These are a Comanche German dictionary, an original map of Comanche hunting and grazing grounds, and an extensive set of notes on Comanche culture. They were published in Germany in 1851, and we discuss all 3 at length in our first book, Comanches and Germans on the Texas Frontier. Is it true that the Moisebach-Comanche Treaty was never broken? The short answer, according to our research, is yes, it is true. While some historians have pointed to records and accounts of Indian atrocities in the region after the treaty date, there is no evidence that any such events were perpetrated by signatories to the treaty or by the Penatakas. The treaty was more than a mere non-aggression pact. It was a pledge of mutual support against enemies. And it includes the words, the Germans, quoting now, the Germans likewise promising to aid the Comanches against their enemies, should they be in danger of having their horses stolen or in any other way to be injured. End of quote. One might therefore even make the case that while the Comanches kept their end of the bargain, it was the Germans who did not provide enough support to prevent the eventual demise of native life in the designated area. As several contemporary accounts agree, the German settlements in the hill country could not have survived without the cooperation of the native population. To that extent, the success of the Moisebach-Comanche Treaty is a key component to the contextual backdrop of the Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung.
In our talk tonight, we have tried to give a sense of the richness of the reporting in the first year of the Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung on the topics of Indians, natural resources in the hill country, and gold, drawing on the research that informs our book, The German Texas Frontier in 1853. Ferdinand Lindheimer, as founding editor of the newspaper, is the central character in our story, and his project as editor has a wider ambition of helping and educating the German population in this part of Texas at this key time with a view to molding a Texas German identity and consciousness. Until now, the contexts of the Zeitung have not been systematically evaluated. By examining closely the first year of the paper's publication, our book offers a piece in a historic mosaic. It does not pretend to be either a complete panorama, a full historical narrative across time, but it's an interesting and, we feel, valuable snapshot. Importantly, what the Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung has to say about Texas, and particularly the central Texas area of German settlement, comes out of the observations and reporting of on-site correspondence and is not merely a rehashing of information from other published sources, newspapers, guidebooks, immigration handbooks. It therefore holds a unique place in the historical record. Our analysis places the Zeitung reportage alongside other recorded documentation, and with this contextualization, the potential of Ferdinand Lindheimer's contribution to Texas history can, we hope, for the first time, be more fully realized. Thank you for your attention. This concludes the formal part of our presentation, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
I'm working on getting my screen started again. Can y'all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Sorry. Nobody could hear me earlier. Thank you. That was fascinating. There are a couple of questions. Larry Gaskamp would like to know who benefited from the work of botanists in those days. I'm guessing he means in 1853.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And the answer is pretty much the whole world, at least the known world at that time. What Lindheimer was doing was not just picking flowers, he was systematically collecting samples of Texas flora in order to be able to send them to Professor Asa Gray at Harvard University, who put them together in sets, labeled, numbered sets, and distributed those sets to museums, herbaria, wealthy noblemen, interested parties in Europe, and also other parts of the United States and the world. And so that this was a very rigorous and systematic taxonomic exercise that Lindheimer was conducting in Texas, done through the agency of academics, in this case in Harvard. He was helped also by George Engelmann, who was the one of the founders of the Missouri Botanical Garden, which is where Lindheimer's papers and sort of botanical records are now kept.
Did he remain a utopian socialist his whole life, or did his environment change his political disposition?
Well, he was somewhat of an idealist. We are uncertain as to what his reasons were for emigrating from Germany in the first place, but one of the strong suspicions is that he was involved in revolutionary activities in Frankfurt. He was associated with the Bunsen family. This is the Bunsen burner people, and had taught in the Bunsen school in Frankfurt. They were very active in politics. So it's quite likely that he initially came to the New World in order to avoid persecution following those political activities. He spent time in Mexico before he came to Texas, and was, before he got to Mexico, was in Illinois at Belleville at the Latin settlement there, the Latin colony of German intellectuals. And when he came to Texas, he initially started farming in the Houston area, was not successful at that. And that's when he sort of reestablished contact with George Engelmann and started on his career as a systematic botanist. And of course, the botany collecting took him into areas that were untraveled by Europeans and other Westerners at that time. So he made a lot of first-hand contact with the native populations and got along with them very well. Of course, as a plant collector, he was thought to be probably a medicine man with considerable powers. And so he was greatly respected by indigenous tribes. He is listed probably mistakenly as one of the early settlers at the Bettina colony on the Llano, which was a communistic settlement. He was there, but he was helping the people who founded the colony rather than being a member of the colony himself. And he used his time there to continue his botanical collecting. And the map that we showed is probably originates from that time.
Oh, is somebody sharing their screen?
Not I.
I'm not sure what's happening.
Hang on.
Okay,
Sorry about that. Is it back to normal, Jay?
Yeah, it looks to be.
Okay.
May I pop in with a question?
Absolutely, Margot, come on.
Fantastic. So you actually already answered half of one of my questions already, where there wasn't a whole lot of articles from other newspapers in this newspaper. But you talked a little bit about how some of the things they were talking about were sort of highlighting how this was a good place for settlement. And so I was just curious, what sort of was the target audience of this newspaper? Was it primarily for people who were already there, or were there maybe particular parts that were syndicated in other newspapers around the United States, or possibly even in Germany, that would sort of get the word out about this being a good place to go and then lure people in? Or was it more Texas-based, or sort of like, how is it connected to the larger sphere of publication?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And initially, it is set up by a committee of people in Neu-Braunfels who decide they need a newspaper for local purposes, and that is the initial target audience. But quite quickly, within this first year of publication, contact is established with other German language newspapers in the US. They start advertising in the Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung, for instance. And also, through the co-editor George von Ross, there is connection to the German newspaper published in Germany, the Auswanderer Zeitung. And it becomes quite quickly evident that part of the remit, if you like, of the Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung is to get news about Texas back to Germany, both personal news about what's happening in different families and what children are being born and who is passing away and so on, but also information about Texas in general as a destination for settlement. The Adelsverein project has already collapsed by this time. There was a lot of negative publicity in Germany about the Adelsverein and its management of its affairs and its bankruptcy, essentially. But there continued to be great interest in Texas as a destination for migration.
Actually got a question via text outside of the chat box. Um, are there any references to Mormons besides those looking for gold? Oh, Dr. Wickham, you're muted. Not sure what.
Oh, that should
Oh,
be.
now you're good now.
Okay. There are a few sporadic references to Mormons, but nothing very sustained within the in that first year. There is quite a bit of interest in what the Mormons are doing, and even in Germany, it's well known that Mormons are active in founding settlements. In the writings of Berghaus, for instance, that we talk about in our first book, there are mentions of the founding of Salt Lake City and what's happening in what's now Utah. Rather derogatory mentions, to be sure, in the case of Berghaus. I think Dan also has some information about what was happening on the ground with Mormons in Texas, though this is not reported on extensively in the newspaper.
Yeah, I guess for those who don't know, we should first point out that the Mormons had a pretty substantial settlement just 2 miles east of Fredericksburg on the Pedernales River, where they had a sawmill, and they were excellent carpenters and lumbermen and furnished a lot of the millwork for the building of Fredericksburg, and were fairly prosperous there. But as Chris alluded to earlier, there was flash flood at one point that destroyed their mill. And there was also mounting suspicion about their community among some segments of the German population, which admired and benefited from the Mormons to some extent, but also were critical of their polygamy. And so as the social environment started getting more hostile and the mill was destroyed, they left their settlement. And I believe at that point, most of them went up to, if I'm getting the sequence right, they went up near Burnett and had a mill up there. Eventually, the large proportion of that group wound up in a settlement which is now under Lake Medina, or would be under Lake Medina if there was any water in it. It's in the valley there. And those people then gradually dispersed. What was interesting to Chris and I was to find some mention of some group or subgroup of these Mormons that took to prospecting north of Fredericksburg. And as I mentioned, we were not able to find any other references to that. We don't know how long it lasted. There's certainly no evidence that they had any kind of community there, but Specht indicates that they seem to be starting to establish a stable settlement, at least as of 1853.
What was the excuse me? What was the initial impression or reaction of the German settlers upon first encountering the Native Americans, being that their cultures were so vastly different?
Well, I think there's, good descriptions of those early encounters in the writings of Raymer. And there were 2 anonymous military men on Moisbach's expedition who published their account in Germany, and then it was republished in Fredericksburg in a commemorative volume around the turn of the century. So we have some accounts. I think it's important to recognize that a good portion of the German population, particularly those in charge of political matters, they were highly educated and literate. And we can see them even while they're still in Germany preparing to come to America. They're thinking about the nature of Native American cultures, how they compare and contrast with those that the Germans are familiar with. There's a kind of romantic sympathy for the Indians as a general principle. And of course, the willingness to get along. One of the things that's striking about their interaction is that they tend to address the Indians as equals and not as inferior people. And so there are comments about some of the dramatic aspects of Indian culture, the number of horses, the behavior of the people, comments about how they, they'll pilfer small possessions, and that's tolerated in their culture when they interact with non-Indians. But those early observations quickly turned to a kind of general attitude of appreciation. And Specht, among others, Krivitz as well, actually, both wrote very eloquently in later years about how the Indians' goodwill and trade were vital to the success of the German colony in its first year. So in Fredericksburg, the supplies from the Adelsverein were highly deficient, and the people survived to a large extent on bear meat and bear grease and other kinds of things that the Indians brought and traded to them. And both Krivitz and Speck point out that at any moment, the Comanches could have overwhelmed the Germans and just destroyed them. And they honored their friendship. And so even though there was turmoil with Indian populations in the later 1850s and into the 1860s, and we read a lot about that, the original settlers had a great fondness for the Penatucket Friends, who watched out for their well-being and honored the agreement.
Marco, did you have another question? We're running short on time, but if you have one more, I think we can get to it.
Sure. Yeah. This is a little bit in his life before becoming a newspaper editor. But as he, was a botanist and collecting samples of plants, you'd mentioned that he had a lot of interactions with Native Americans, and he was in areas where obviously they were as well. Is there any evidence of them maybe even helping him in his plant collection, or maybe sharing knowledge of plants, or teaching him anything, or anything along those lines? So some sort of collaboration?
There is some evidence in Lindheimer's other writings. One of our slides showed the cover of a book, a translation by John Williams of the only book by Lindheimer, which is actually a collection of articles and essays edited by one of his earlier students. In there, you do find references to things, botanical things that he either explicitly says he did learn from the Indians, or which one may surmise he probably learned from the Indians, having to do with medicine, healing, but also foodstuffs, diet, what you can eat, what you can't, and what you can do with different things, and which ones you can use to catch fish and so on. So the place to look for Lindheimer's awareness of the botany of Texas gleaned from natives is really in that book of essays. And we do rather pull those things together in our own introductory discussion of Lindheimer in his sort of pre-Neu-Braunfelser Zeitung activities in our book that we've been talking about today.
I would just add, beyond the engagements that Chris just mentioned, it seems a great tragedy to American anthropology that Lindheimer did not record his interactions with the Indians in any detail, or take the time to preserve any ethnographic information. He was in a fantastic position to do that. So even if he was learning to use plants from native peoples, he didn't, for example, record the names of those in the Indian languages, all the kinds of things that anthropologists today would love to have access to. He was totally compartmentalized as a botanist. And while we love him for his work, we do regret that he wasn't more ethnographically minded at the same time.
Unfortunately, we are out of time for this episode. I'm sorry if we didn't get to all of your questions. I will try to get them down and email Dr. Wickham and Dr. Gelo and see if they can answer, and we can add it to our follow-up with when we send out the final recording of the episode. Thank y'all so much for bringing Texas German history to TSHA members tonight. And I'm so happy about this partnership. I hope that we can do more episodes in the future together. And like I mentioned before, I hope that we can have y'all at annual meeting for a session on something along these lines. I think it would be really interesting for our people. We have a couple of closeout announcements before we end. We hope to see everybody back again on April 15th for the next episode of Texas Talks, which will be with the Whitty Museum in San Antonio. They're going to talk about the traveling exhibits and the goings on at the museum. We also have Texas History Day coming up here in Austin on April 5th. I believe we are still looking for judges for 5 different categories: research papers, exhibits, performances, websites, and documentaries. If you're interested in being a judge, drop me a line and we can talk about it. TSHA's next event is our brand new one, the Texas Revolution Rendezvous on April 25th through 27th at the Menger Hotel in San Antonio, where we will expand on the excellent scholarly record of the San Jacinto Symposium and offer a more inclusive exploration of the battles, events, and people that defined Texas during its fight for independence. The registration for the symposium is only $30 for adults, and children are free. With that, you get free admission to the Briscoe Western Art Museum, the Whitty Museum, and the Ralston Family Collection. So I would think about going to San Antonio for the 25th through 27th, if not just to go to the museums. We hope to see you guys all there. And our new friends, the German Texan Heritage Society, has several events throughout the year, such as Mayfay, Oktoberfest, and the most authentic German Christmas market around in the Austin area. They will be having an annual conference in September, which will include a series of talks about Texas German history. For anyone interested in genealogy, they have around 200 family histories, memoirs, and other genealogical resources that have been donated to GTHS over the years and are open to the public to read. For more information about those resources or any of the programs, please visit their website. We've just dropped it in the chat box, germantexans.org. And we thank you guys for joining us tonight.